Hello. Hello, hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are continuing on with The Hunchback of Notre-Dame by Victor Hugo, starting with part 1, book 2nd, chapter 7. But first, reading updates. I have been listening to Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. It is a translated book, and the translator is Ginny Tapley, and really liked it. Really liked it. I listened to it in 3 days. It's about 7 hours, but I listened to it at like 1.5 speed, so it's a little bit shorter than that. But really liked it. Lots of content warnings. So if, you're a little hesitant about some material, maybe look into those before starting. But very weird, very disturbing, very good. Let's see. Am I reading? Well, I'm reading Robin Hobb, of course. And I just picked up from the library a Stephen King book. Well, no, it's not my first Stephen King. Just kidding. That was going to be a lie. My second Stephen King book. It's called Holly, and it won the Goodreads Choice Award for Best Horror of 2023. So we shall see. I didn't think that I enjoyed reading horror, but every time I read like a top pick for horror in like this category, this is like the third year that I'm doing this, I've really liked it. So maybe I'm a horror reading girly. Maybe. We'll see. But I know nothing about it. I know that this character, Holly, the titular character, I know that she is in other works of his, but I don't know anything about her or anything. I don't know anything. I'm just going in. I'm just diving right in. But I think that's all I'm currently reading or listening to or what have you. Today, Hunchback. Hunchback of Notre Dame. So, recap. Things actually happened last time, which is exciting. Plot points have happened. It wasn't just us wandering around the streets of Paris looking at buildings and admiring the beautiful gothic architecture. Things happened. Okay, so we had the Feast of Fools where Quasimodo was like, "Oh my gosh, you are so ugly. Let's parade you around." And so they like put a crown on him. They give him like a robe. They like lift him up and they're like going through the streets like parading him around. And he's kind of enjoying the attention. He doesn't really get noticed a lot in the world because of his stature and his appearance. And so because of that, a lot of people think that like he works with the demon and all of these other things, all these other like hocus pocus things that people say about people that are different. And then we also met Esmeralda, who is a performer in the streets of Paris. She looks Egyptian and she has a little goat, which is so cute. And she's also getting comments as she's performing about how she's like the devil and to go back to where she came from and all these terrible things. And then we have Gringoire, and Gringoire is down on his luck. Nobody paid attention to his play during the festival, and so he's like really bummed about that. He doesn't have any money, he doesn't have any food, he doesn't have anywhere to sleep. So he stumbles across Esmeralda performing and is like, I'm gonna follow her because she probably has somewhere to sleep. So he creepily follows her down the streets of Paris in the middle of the night, and well, it's weird. It's weird. But Esmeralda gets attacked, and Gringoire is there and sort of stops the attack. He yells for other people to stop the attack. Quasimodo comes down. He like swoops Esmeralda up on his shoulder. The guards, like the king's guards, are there. They see all of this. They think Quasimodo's the bad guy. Things have happened. And we also meet our captain of the guard, who Esmeralda is like, "Ooh, who are you?" type of a deal. And then so Gringoire is still like, oh man, I still don't really understand what's happening. So he's walking around the streets and he gets cornered by these three ruffians of the streets who have been begging for money, and he doesn't have any money. And so they're like, "Well, we need to take you to the king." And so they take him to the king, and the king is this guy who, well, in the area where they are, they have all of these other people who are like panhandlers, like during the day, like asking for money, like trying to get help, and they look like they have like a bunch of injuries and wounds and like frothing at the mouth, diseases, all of these things, but they're mostly fake. And we're watching them prepare for the next day for their um, asking for money for their job. And so the king is like, "Look, you are part of the bourgeois." And Gungwar is like, "No, I'm not. Trust me, I'm a poet. I am not part of that life." And the king's like, "Yeah, you are. We're gonna hang you, okay? Unless you can do this impossible task of pickpocketing this doll without making any of the bells go off." And he's unable to do it, and so he's like about to be killed. And he's like, "Oh, wait, wait, wait." The king's like, "Wait, there's one more rule. If any of these women want to marry you, then you can be a vagabond with us." And the ladies like line up and they're like one by one, like, "No, no, no, no." And so the king is like, "All right, well, sorry, brother." And so then, as Gringoire is about to be like killed in front of all of these people that are like, "Let's do it," Esmeralda shows up and she's like, "I will marry him." And so they get married, and then Gringoire smashes a pot on the floor. It breaks in four pieces, which means they are now married for 4 years. And that's where we left off. Ooh, ooh. Okay, so we are part one, book second, chapter 7, A Bridal Night. Everybody get cozy. A few moments later, our poet found himself in a tiny arched chamber, very cozy, very warm, seated at a table which appeared to ask nothing better than to make some loans for a larder hanging nearby, having a good bed in prospect, and alone with a pretty girl. The adventure smacked of enchantment. He began seriously to take himself for a personage in a fairy tale. He cast his eyes about him from time to time, as though to see if the chariot of fire, harnessed to two winged chimeras, which alone could have so rapidly transported him from Tartarus to paradise, was still there. At times, also, he fixed his eyes obstinately upon the holes in his doublet, in order to cling to reality, and not lose the ground from under his feet completely. His reason, tossed about in imaginary space, now hung only by this thread. The young girl did not appear to pay any attention to him. She went and came, displaced a stool, talked to her goat, and indulged in a pout now and then. At last she came and seated herself near the table, and Gringoire was about to scrutinize her at his ease. You have been a child, reader, and you would, perhaps, be very happy to be one still. It is quite certain that you have not, more than once, and for my part I have passed whole days, the best employed of my life, at it, followed from thicket to thicket, by the side of running water on a sunny day, a beautiful green or blue dragonfly, breaking its flight in abrupt angles, and kissing the tips of all the branches. You recollect with what amorous curiosity your thought and your gaze were riveted upon this little whirlwind, hissing and humming with wings of purple and azure, in the midst of which floated an imperceptible body, veiled by the very rapidity of its movement. The aerial being, which was dimly outlined amid this quivering of wings, appeared to you chimerical, imaginary, impossible to touch, impossible to see. But when, at length, the dragonfly alighted on the tip of a reed, and, holding your breath the while, you were able to examine the long gauze wings, the long enamel robe, the two globes of crystal, what astonishment you felt! And what fear lest you should again behold the form disappear into a shade, and the creature into a chimera. Recall these impressions, and you will readily appreciate what Gringoire felt on contemplating, beneath her visible and palpable form, that Esmeralda of whom, up to that time, he had only caught a glimpse amidst a whirlwind of dance, song, and tumult. Sinking deeper and deeper into his reverie, "So this," he said to himself, following her vaguely with his eyes, "is La Esmeralda, a celestial creature, a street dancer, so much and so little. 'Twas she who dealt the death blow to my mystery this morning. 'Tis she who saves my life this evening. My evil genius, my good angel, a pretty woman, on my word, and who must needs love me madly to have taken me in that fashion. By the way," said he, rising suddenly, with that sentiment of the true which formed the foundation of his character and his philosophy, "I don't know very well how it happens, but I am her husband." With this idea in his head and in his eyes, he stepped up to the young girl in a manner so military and so gallant that she drew back. "What do you want of me?" said she. "Can you ask me, adorable Esmeralda?" replied Gringoire, who, with so passionate an accent that he was himself astonished at it on hearing himself speak. The young girl opened her eyes again. "I don't know what you mean." "What?" resumed Gringoire, growing warmer and warmer, and supposing that, after all, he had to deal merely with the virtue of the court of miracles. "Am I not thine, sweet friend? Art thou not mine?" And, quite ingeniously, he clasped her waist. The young girl's corsage slipped through his hands like the skin of an eel. She bounded from one end of the tiny room to the other, stooped down, and raised herself again, with a little poniard in her hand, before Gringoire had even had time to see whence the poniard had come. Proud and angry, with swelling lips and inflated nostrils, her cheeks as red as an apple, and her eyes darting lightnings. At the same time, the white goat placed itself in front of her, and presented to Gringoire a hostile front, bristling with two pretty horns, gilded and very sharp. All this took place in the twinkling of an eye. The dragonfly had turned into a wasp, and asked nothing better than to sting. Our philosopher was speechless, and turned his astonished eyes from the goat to the young girl. "Holy Virgin!" he said at last, when surprise permitted him to speak. "Here are two hardy dames." The young girl broke the silence on her side. "You must be a very bold knave." "Pardon, mademoiselle," said Gringoire with a smile, "but why did you take me for your husband?" "Should I have allowed you to be hanged?" "So," said the poet, somewhat disappointed in his amorous hopes, "you had no other idea in marrying me than to save me from the gibbet?" "And what other idea did you suppose that I had?" Gringoire bit his lip. "Come," he said, "I am not yet so triumphant in Cupidon as I thought. But then, what was the good of breaking that poor jug?" Meanwhile, Esmeralda's dagger and the goat's horns were still upon the defensive. "Mademoiselle Esmeralda," said the poet, "let us come to terms. I am not a clerk of the court, and I shall not go to law with you for thus carrying a dagger in Paris, in the teeth of the ordinances and prohibitions of Monsieur the Provost. Nevertheless, you are not ignorant of the fact that Noël Lescrivain was condemned a week ago to pay 10 Parisian sous for having carried a cutlass. But this is no affair of mine, and I will come to the point. I swear to you, upon my share of paradise, not to approach you without your leave and permission, but to give me some supper." The truth is, Gringoire was, like Monsieur Despreaux, not very voluptuous. He did not belong to that chevalier and musketeer species, who take young girls by assault. In the matter of love, as in all other affairs, he willingly assented to temporizing and adjusting terms, and a good supper and an amiable tete-a-tete appeared to him, especially when he was hungry, an excellent interlude between the prologue and the catastrophe of a love adventure. The young girl did not reply. She made her disdainful little grimace, drew up her head like a bird, then burst out laughing, and the tiny poniard disappeared as it had come, without Gringoire being able to see where the wasp concealed its sting. A moment later, there stood upon the table a loaf of rye bread, a slice of bacon, some wrinkled apples, and a jug of beer. Gringoire began to eat eagerly. One would have said, to hear the furious clashing of his iron fork and his earthenware plate, that all his love had turned to appetite. The young girl seated opposite him watched him in silence, visibly preoccupied with another thought, at which she smiled from time to time, while her soft hand caressed the intelligent head of the goat, gently pressed between her knees. A candle of yellow wax illuminated this scene of veracity and reverie. Meanwhile, the first cravings of his stomach having been stilled, Gringoire felt some false shame at perceiving that nothing remained but one apple. "You do not eat, Mademoiselle Esmeralda?" She replied by a negative sign of the head, and her pensive glance fixed itself upon the vault of the ceiling. What the deuce is she thinking of? Thought Gringoire, staring at what she was gazing at. 'Tis impossible that it can be that stone dwarf carved in the keystone of that arch, which thus absorbs her attention. What the deuce? I can bear the comparison. He raised his voice. Mademoiselle. She seemed not to hear him. He repeated, still more loudly, Mademoiselle Esmeralda. Trouble wasted. The young girl's mind was elsewhere, and Gringoire's voice had not the power to recall it. Fortunately, the goat interfered. She began to pull her mistress gently by the sleeve. What dost thou want, Jolly? said the young girl hastily, as though suddenly awakened. She is hungry, said Gringoire, charmed to enter into conversation. Esmeralda began to crumble some bread, which Jolly ate gracefully from the hollow of her hand. Moreover, Gringoire did not give her time to resume her reverie. He hazarded a delicate question. So, you do not want me for your husband? The young girl looked at him intently and said, No. For your lover? Went on Gringoire. She pouted and replied, No. For your friend? Pursued Gringoire. She gazed fixedly at him again and said, after a momentary reflection, Perhaps. This perhaps, so dear to philosophers, emboldened Gringoire. Do you know what friendship is? He asked. Yes, she replied. It is to be brother and sister, two souls which touch without mingling, two fingers on one hand. And love? Pursued Gringoire. Oh, love, said she, and her voice trembled and her eye beamed. That is to be two, and to be but one, a man and a woman mingled into one angel. It is heaven. The street dancer had a beauty, as she spoke thus, that struck Gringoire singularly, and seemed to him in perfect keeping with the almost oriental exaltation of her words. Her pure red lips half smiled, her serene and candid brow became troubled at intervals under her thoughts, like a mirror under the breath, and from beneath her long, drooping, black eyelashes there escaped a sort of ineffable light, which gave to her profile that ideal serenity which Raphael found at the mystic point of intersection of virginity, maternity, and divinity. Nevertheless, Gringoire continued. What must one be, then, in order to please you? A man. And I, said he, what then am I? A man has a helmet on his head, a sword in his hand, and golden spurs on his heels. Good, said Gringoire. Without a horse, no man. Do you love anyone? As a lover? Yes. She remained thoughtful for a moment, then said with a peculiar expression, That I shall know soon. Why not this evening? Resumed the poet tenderly. Why not me? She cast a grave glance upon him and said, I can never love a man who cannot protect me. Gringoire colored and took the hint. It was evident that the young girl was alluding to the slight assistance which he had rendered her in the critical situation in which she had found herself 2 hours previously. This memory, effaced by his own adventures of the evening, now recurred to him. He smote his brow. By the way, mademoiselle, I ought to have begun there. Pardon my foolish absence of mind. How do you contrive to escape from the claws of Quasimodo? This question made her shudder. Oh, the horrible hunchback, she said, hiding her face in her hands, and she shuddered as though with violent cold. Horrible, in truth, said Gringoire, who clung to his idea. But how did you manage to escape him? La Esmeralda smiled, sighed, and remained silent. Do you know why he followed you? Began Gringoire again, seeking to return to his question by a circuitous route. I don't know, said the young girl, and she added hastily, but you were following me also. Why were you following me? In good faith, responded Gringoire. I don't know either. Silence ensued. Gringoire slashed the table with his knife. The young girl smiled and seemed to be gazing through the wall at something. All at once, she began to sing in a barely articulate voice, Cuando las pintadas aves mudas están y la tierra. And there is a footnote here, and it says, when the gay-plumaged birds grow weary and the earth. She broke off abruptly and began to caress her goat. It's a pretty animal of yours, said Gringoire. She is my sister, she answered. Why are you called La Esmeralda? Asked the poet. I do not know. But why? She drew from her bosom a sort of little oblong bag, suspended from her neck by a string of beads. This bag exhaled a strong odor of camphor. It was covered with green silk, and bore in its center a large piece of green glass, in imitation of an emerald. Perhaps it is because of this, said she. Gringoire was on the point of taking the bag in his hand. She drew back. Don't touch it. It is an amulet. You would injure the charm, or the charm would injure you. The poet's curiosity was more and more aroused. Who gave it to you? She laid one finger on her mouth and concealed the amulet in her bosom. He tried a few more questions, but she hardly replied. What is the meaning of the words La Esmeralda? I do not know, said she. To what language do they belong? They are Egyptian, I think. I suspected as much, said Gringoire. You are not a native of France? I don't know. Are your parents alive? She began to sing to an ancient air. It's in French, but there is a translation. And it says, my father is a bird, my mother is a bird. I cross the water without a barque, excuse me. I cross the water without a boat. My mother is a bird, my father is a bird. Oops. Good, said Gringoire. At what age did you come to France? When I was very young. And when to Paris? Last year. At the moment when we were entering the Papal Gate, I saw a reed warbler flit through the air. That was at the end of August. I said, "It will be a hard winter." "So it was," said Gringoire, delighted at this beginning of a conversation. "I passed it in blowing my fingers. You have the gift of prophecy?" She retired into her laconics again. "Is that man whom you call the Duke of Egypt the chief of your tribe?" "Yes." "But it was he who married us," remarked the poet timidly. She made her customary pretty grimace. "I don't even know your name." My name? If you want it, here it is. Pierre Gringoire." "Oh, I know a prettier one," said she. "Naughty girl," retorted the poet. "Never mind, you shall not provoke me. Wait, perhaps you will love me more when you know me better, and then you have told me your story with so much confidence that I owe you a little of mine. You must know, then, that my name is Pierre Gringoire, and that I am a son of a farmer of the notary's office. My father was hung by the Burgundians, and my mother disemboweled by the Picards at the siege of Paris 20 years ago. At 6 years of age, therefore, I was an orphan, without a soul to my foot except the pavement of Paris. I do not know how I passed the interval from 6 to 16. A fruit dealer gave me a plum here. A baker flung me a crust there. In the evening I got myself taken up by the watch, who threw me into prison, and there I found a bundle of straw. All this did not prevent my growing up and growing thin, as you see. In the winter I warmed myself in the sun, under the porch of the Hotel de Sens, and I thought it very ridiculous that the fire of St. John's Day was reserved for the dog days. At 16, I wished to choose a calling. I tried all in succession. I became a soldier, but I was not brave enough. I became a monk, but I was not sufficiently devout. And then I'm a bad hand at drinking. In despair I became an apprentice of the woodcutters, but I was not strong enough. I had more of an inclination to become a schoolmaster. 'Tis true that I did not know how to read, but that's no reason. I perceived at the end of a certain time that I lacked something in every direction, and seeing that I was good for nothing, of my own free will I became a poet and rhymester. That is a trade which one can always adopt when one is a vagabond, and it's better than stealing, as some young brigands of my acquaintance advised me to do so. One day I met my luck. Dom Claude Frollo, the Reverend Archdeacon of Notre-Dame. He took an interest in me, and it is to him that I today owe it that I am a veritable man of letters, who knows Latin from the De Officiis of Cicero to the Mortuology of the Celestine Fathers, and a barbarian neither in scholastics, nor in politics, nor in rhythmics, that sophism of sophisms. I am the author of the mystery which was presented today with great triumph and a great concourse of populace in the grand hall of the Palace of Justice. I have also made a book which will contain 600 pages on the wonderful comet of 1465, which sent one man mad. I have enjoyed still other successes. Being somewhat of an artillery carpenter, I lent a hand to Jean Mackay's great bombard, which burst, as you know, on the day when it was tested, and the Pont de Charenton, and killed 24 curious spectators. You see that I am not a bad match in marriage. I know a great many sorts of very engaging tricks, which I will teach your goat, for example, to make it mimic the Bishop of Paris, that cursed Pharisee whose mill wheels splash passers-by the whole length of the Pont aux Meuniers. And then my mystery will bring me in a great deal of coined money, if they will only pay me. And finally, I am at your orders, I and my wits, and my science and my letters, ready to live with you, damsel, as it shall please you, chastely or joyously, husband and wife, if you see fit, brother and sister, if you think that better." Gringoire ceased, waiting the effect of his harangue on the young girl. Her eyes were fixed on the ground. "Phoebus," she said in a low voice. Then, turning towards the poet, "Phoebus, what does that mean?" Gringoire, without exactly understanding what the connection could be between his address and this question, was not sorry to display his erudition. Assuming an air of importance, he replied, "It is a Latin word which means sun." "Sun," she repeated. "It is the name of a handsome archer, who was a god," added Gringoire. "A god," repeated the young girl, and there was something pensive and passionate in her tone. At that moment, one of her bracelets became unfastened and fell. Gringoire stooped quickly to pick it up. When he straightened up, the young girl and the goat had disappeared. He heard the sound of a bolt. It was a little door, communicating, no doubt, with a neighboring cell, which was being fastened on the outside. "Has she left me a bed, at least?" said the philosopher. He made the tour of his cell. There was no piece of furniture adapted to sleeping purposes, except a tolerably long wooden coffer, and its cover was carved, to boot, which afforded Gringoire, when he stretched himself out upon it, a sensation somewhat similar to that which Micromegas would feel if he were to lie down on the Alps. "Come," said he, adjusting himself as well as possible, "I must resign myself. But here's a strange nuptial night. 'Tis a pity. There was something innocent and antediluvian about that broken crock which quite pleased me." End of the chapter, and end of book second. Okay, so this one, they're married. Gringoire and La Esmeralda are married, and so they leave the crowd and they go to a dwelling of some sort, and he's like, "All right, we're married now, you know what that means," and she's like, "Yeah, no, maybe not." And Gringoire's like, "Yeah, okay, cool. I'm not gonna force you," which, love that. And so they're trying to get to know each other just a little bit, just as, they're married. They might as well get to know each other. And this whole time, like, Gringoire's asking questions and she's barely answering. They're like very, very short, like, "I don't know where I'm from. I don't know what happened to my parents," like all of these things. And this whole time while she's answering these questions, she's like kind of staring off into space, not really paying attention to the conversation. And Gringoire is like, "Oh, silly me. You don't know anything about me." And then like spins this tale about how he's not this because he couldn't do this, he's not this because he couldn't do this, like all of these things. And he's like, "So I'm a poet." And she is like not very impressed by this, and she just is so distracted and asks, "What does Phoebus mean?" And the poet's like, "Well, I don't really understand why she's asking me this, but it means the sun and also is a Greek god and like an archer god." And she's like, "Oh, okay, cool." And then she drops a bracelet. He bends down to pick it up, and when he comes up, she's gone. She's gone, her goat's gone, everybody's gone. And that is the name of our head of the King's Guard. Na-na-na. And that's the end of the chapter. Book third, chapter 1. Notre-Dame. The church of Notre-Dame de Paris is still, no doubt, a majestic and sublime edifice. But, beautiful as it has been preserved in growing old, it is difficult not to sigh, not to wax indignant before the numberless degradations and mutilations which time and men have both caused the venerable monument to suffer, without respect for Charlemagne, who laid its first stone, or for Philip Augustus, who laid the last. On the face of this aged queen of our cathedrals, by the side of a wrinkle, one always finds a scar. Tempus edex homo edacier. There's a footnote, and it says, "Time is a devourer, man more so," which I should be glad to translate thus: "Time is blind, man is stupid." If we had leisure to examine with the reader, one by one, the diverse traces of destruction imprinted upon the old church, Time's share would be the least, the share of men and men the most, especially the men of art, since there have been individuals who assumed the title of architects architects during the last 2 centuries. And, in the first place, to cite only a few leading examples, there certainly are few finer architectural pages than this facade, where successfully and at once the 3 portals hollowed out in an arch, and broidered and dentated cordon of the 28 royal niches. The immense central rose window, flanked by its 2 lateral windows, like a priest by his deacon and subdeacon. The frail and lofty gallery of trefoil arcades, which supports a heavy platform above its fine, slender columns. And lastly, the 2 black and massive towers with their slate penthouses, harmonious parts of a magnificent whole, superposed in 5 gigantic stories, develop themselves before the eye, in a mass and without confusion, with their innumerable details of statuary, carving, and sculpture, joined powerfully to the tranquil grandeur of a whole, a vast symphony in stone, so to speak, the colossal work of one man and one people, altogether one and complex, like the Iliads and the Romanceros, whose sister it is, prodigious product of the groupings together of all the forces of an epoch, where, upon each stone, one sees the fancy of the workman disciplined by the genius of the artist start forth in 100 fashions, a sort of human creation, in a word, powerful and fecund as the divine creation of which it seems to have stolen the double character, variety, eternity. And what we here say of the facade must be said of the entire church, and what we say of the cathedral church of Paris must be said of all the churches of Christendom in the Middle Ages. All things are in place in that art, self-created, logical, and well proportioned. To measure the great toe of the foot is to measure the giant. Let us return to the facade of Notre-Dame, as it still appears to us, when we go piously to admire the grave and puissant cathedral, which inspires terror, so it chronicles assert, que mole suet terrarum incutit sanctibus. 3 important things are today lacking in that facade. In the first place, the staircase of 11 steps which formerly raised it above the soil. Next, the lower series of statues which occupied the niches of the 3 portals, and lastly, the upper series of the 28 most ancient kings of France, which garnished the gallery of the first story, beginning with Childebert and ending with Philip Augustus, holding in his hand the imperial apple. Time has caused the staircase to disappear, by raising the soil of the city with a slow and irresistible progress, but, while thus causing the 11 steps which added to the majestic height of the edifice to be devoured, one, by the rising tide of the pavements of Paris, time has bestowed upon the church perhaps more than it has taken away, for it is time which has spread over the facade that somber hue of the centuries which makes the old age of monuments the period of their beauty. But who has thrown down the 2 rows of statues? Who has left the niches empty? Who has cut, in the very middle of the central portal, that new and bastard arch? Who has dared to frame therein that commonplace and heavy door of carved wood à la Louis XV, beside the arabesques of Biscornet? The men, the architects, the artists of our day. And if we enter the interior of the edifice, who has overthrown that colossus of St. Christopher, proverbial for magnitude among statues, as the grand hall of the Palace of Justice was among halls, as the spire of Strasbourg among spires? And those myriads of statues which peopled all the spaces between the columns of the nave and the choir, kneeling, standing, equestrian, men, women, children, kings, bishops, gardens, in stone, in marble, in gold, in silver, in copper, in wax even, who has brutally swept them away? It is not time. And who subdued for the ancient Gothic altar, splendidly encumbered with shrines and reliquaries, that heavy marble sarcophagus with angels' heads and clouds, which seem a specimen pillaged on the Val de Grace or the Invalides? Who stupidly sealed that heavy anachronism of stone in the Carlovingian pavement of Hercandus? Was it not Louis the 14th, fulfilling the request of Louis the 13th? And who put the cold, white panes in the place of those windows, high in color, which caused the astonished eyes of our fathers to hesitate between the rows of the grand portal and the arches of the apse? And what would a sub-chamber of the 16th century say, on beholding the beautiful yellow wash with which our archiepiscopal vandals have besmeared their cathedral? He would remember that it was the color with which the hangman smeared accursed edifices. He would recall the Hotel de Petit Bourbon, all smeared thus on account of the constable's treason. Yellow, after all, of so good a quality, said Sauval, and so well recommended that more than a century has not yet caused it to lose its color. He would think that the sacred place had become infamous, and would flee. And if we ascend the cathedral, without mentioning 1,000 barbarisms of every sort, what has become of that charming little bell tower, which rested upon the point of intersection of the cross roofs, and which, no less frail and no less bold than its neighbors, also destroyed? The spire of the Sainte-Chapelle buried itself in the sky, farther forward than the towers, slender, pointed, sonorous, carved in open work. An architect of good taste amputated it, 1787, and considered it sufficient to mask the wound with that large leaden plaster which resembles a pot cover. 'Tis thus that the marvelous state of the Middle Ages has been treated in nearly every country, especially in France. One can distinguish on its ruins 3 sorts of lesions, all 3 of which cut into it at different depths. First, time, which has insensibly notched its surface here and there and gnawed it everywhere. Next, political and religious revolution, which, blind and wrathful by nature, have flung themselves tumultuously upon it, torn its rich garment of carving and sculpture, burst its rose windows, broken its necklace of arabesques and tiny figures, torn out its statues, sometimes because of their mitres, sometimes because of their crowns. Lastly, fashions, even more grotesque and foolish, which, since the anarchical and splendid deviations of the Renaissance, have followed each other in the necessary decadence of architecture. Fashions have wrought more harm than revolutions. They have cut to the quick. They have attacked the very bone and framework of art. They have cut, slashed, disorganized, killed the edifice, in form as in the symbol, in its consistency as well as in its beauty. And then they have made it over, a presumption of which neither time nor revolutions at least have been guilty. They have audaciously adjusted, in the name of good taste, upon the wounds of Gothic architecture, their miserable gewgaws of a day, their ribbons of marble, their pom-poms of metal, a veritable leprosy of egg-shaped ornaments, volutes, whorls, draperies, garlands, fringes, stone flames, bronze clouds, pudgy cupids, cubby-cheeked cherubim, which begin to devour the face of art in the oratory of Catherine de Medicis, and cause it to expire 2 centuries later, tortured and grimacing in the Bordeaux of the Dubarry. Thus, to sum up the points which we have just indicated, 3 sorts of ravages today disfigure Gothic architecture. Wrinkles and warts on the epidermis. This is the work of time. Deeds of violence, brutalities, contusions, fractures. This is the work of the revolutions from Luther to Mirabeau. Mutilations, amputations, dislocation of the joints, restorations. This is the Greek Roman and barbarian work of professors according to Vitruvius and Vignoli. This magnificent art produced by the Vandals has been slain by the academies. The centuries, the revolutions which at least devastate with impartiality and grandeur, have been joined by a cloud of school architects, licensed, sworn, and bound by oath, defacing with the discernment and choice of bad taste, substituting the chicories of Louis XV for the Gothic lace, for the greater glory of the Parthenon. It is the kick of the ass at the dying lion. It is the old oak crowning itself, and which, to heap a measure full, is stung, beaten, and gnawed by caterpillars. How far it is from the epoch when Robert Senolis, comparing Notre-Dame de Paris to the famous temple of Diana at Ephesus, so much lauded by the ancient pagans, which Erostasis has immortalized, found the Gallic temple more excellent in length, breadth, height, and structure. Notre Dame is not, moreover, what can be called a complete, definite, classified monument. It is no longer a Romanesque church, nor is it a Gothic church. This edifice is not a type. Notre Dame de Paris has not, like the Abbey of Tournus, the grave and massive frame, the large and round vault, the glacial bareness, the majestic simplicity of the edifices which have the rounded arch for their progenitor. It is not, like the Cathedral of Bourges, the magnificent light, multiform, tufted, bristling efflorescent product of the pointed arch. Impossible to class it in that ancient family of somber, mysterious churches, low and crushed, as it were, by the round arch, almost Egyptian, with the exception of the ceiling, all hieroglyphics, all sacerdotal, all symbolical, all more loaded in their ornaments with lozenges and zigzags than with flowers than with animals than with men, the work of the architect less than of the bishop. First transformation of art, all impressed with theocratic and military discipline, taking root in the Lower Empire and stopping with the time of William the Conqueror. Impossible to place our cathedral in that other family of lofty, aerial churches, rich in painted windows and sculpture, pointed in form, bold in attitude, communal and bourgeois as political symbols, free, capricious, lawless as a work of art. Second transformation of architecture, no longer hieroglyphic, immovable and sacerdotal, but artistic, progressive and popular, which begins at the return from the Crusades and ends with Louis IX. Notre-Dame de Paris is not of pure Romanesque, like the first, not of pure Arabian race, like the second. It is an edifice of the transition period. The Saxon architect completed the erection of the first pillars of the nave, when the pointed arch, which dates from the Crusade, arrived and placed itself as a conqueror upon the large Romanesque capitals which should support only round arches. The pointed arch, mistress since that time, constructed the rest of the church. Nevertheless, timid and inexperienced at the start, it sweeps out, grows larger, restrains itself, and dares no longer dart upwards in spires and lancet windows, as it did later on, in so many marvelous cathedrals. One would say that it were conscious of the vicinity of the heavy Romanesque pillars. However, these edifices of the transition from the Romanesque to the Gothic are no less precious for study than the pure types. They express a shade of the art which would be lost without them. It is the graft of the pointed upon the round arch. Notre-Dame de Paris is, in particular, a curious specimen of this variety. Each face, each stone of the venerable monument, is a page not only of the history of the country, but of the history of science and art as well. Thus, in order to indicate here only the principal details, while the little red door almost attains to the limits of the Gothic delicacy of the 15th century. The pillars of the nave, by their size and weight, go back to the Carlovian abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. One would suppose that 6 centuries separated these pillars from that door. There is no one, not even the Hermetics, who does not find in the symbols of the grand portal a satisfactory compendium of their science, of which the church of Saint Jacques de la Boucherie was so complete a hieroglyph. Thus, the Roman abbey, the philosopher's church, the Gothic art, Saxon art, the heavy, round pillar which recalls Gregory the Seventh, the Hermetic symbolism with which Nicholas Flamel played the prelude to Luther, papal unity, schism, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie, all are mingled, combined, amalgamated in Notre-Dame. This central mother church is, among the ancient churches of Paris, a sort of chimera. It has the head of one, the limbs of another, the haunches of another, something of all. We repeat it. These hybrid constructions are not the least interesting for the artist, for the antiquarian, for the historian. They make one feel to what a degree architecture is a primitive thing by demonstrating what is also demonstrated by the Cyclopean vestiges, the pyramids of Egypt, the gigantic Hindu pagodas, that the greatest products of architecture are less the works of individuals than of society, rather the offspring of a nation's effort than the inspired flash of a man of genius, the deposit left by a whole people, the heaps accumulated by centuries, the residue of successive evaporations of human society. In a word, species of formations. Each wave of time contributes its alluvium. Each race deposits its layer on the monument. Each individual brings his stone. Thus do the beavers. Thus do the bees. Thus do men. The great symbol of architecture, Babel, is a hive. Great edifices, like great mountains, are the work of centuries. Art often undergoes a transformation while they are pendent opera interrupta. They proceed quietly in accordance with the transformed art. The new art takes the monument where it finds it, encrusts itself there, assimilates it to itself, develops it according to its fancy, and finishes it, if it can. The thing is accomplished without trouble, without effort, without reaction, following a natural and tranquil law. It is a graft which shoots up, a sap which circulates, a vegetation which starts forth anew. Certainly, there is matter here for many large volumes, and often the universal history of humanity in the successive engrafting of many arts at many levels upon the same monument. The man, the artist, the individual, is effaced in these great masses which lack the name of their author. Human intelligence is there summed up and totalized. Time is the architect, the nation is the builder. Not to consider here anything except the Christian architecture of Europe, that younger sister of the great masonries of the Orient, it appears to the eyes as an immense formation divided into 3 well-defined zones, which are superposed the one upon the other, the Romanesque zone, the Gothic zone, the zone of the Renaissance, which we will gladly call the Greco-Roman zone. The Roman layer, which is the most ancient and deepest, is occupied by the round arch which reappears, supported by the Greek column, in the modern and upper layer of the Renaissance. The pointed arch is found between the two. The edifices, which belong exclusively to any one of these 3 layers, are perfectly distinct, uniform, and complete. There is the Abbey of Chimulege, there is the Cathedral of Rheims, there is the Sainte Croix of Orleans, but the three zones mingled and amalgamated along the edges, like the colors of the solar spectrum. Hence complex monuments, edifices of gradation and transition. One is Roman at the base, Gothic in the middle, Greco-Roman at the top. It is because it was 600 years in the building. This variety is rare. The Donjon Keep of Temps is a specimen of it. But monuments of two formations are more frequent. There is Notre-Dame de Paris, a pointed arch edifice, which is embedded by its pillars in that Roman zone, in which are plunged the portal of Saint Denis and the nave of Saint Germain-des-Prés. There is the charming, half-Gothic chapter house of Beaucheville, where the Roman layer extends halfway up. There's the cathedral of Rouen, which would be entirely Gothic if it did not bathe the tip of its central spire to the zone of the Renaissance. However, all these shades, all these differences do not affect the surfaces of edifices only. It is art which has changed its skin. The very constitution of the Christian Church is not attacked by it. There is always the same internal woodwork, the same logical arrangement of parts. Whatever may be carved and embroidered envelope of a cathedral, one always finds beneath it, in the state of a germ and of a rudiment at the least, the Roman basilica. It is eternally developed upon the soil according to the same law. There are, invariably, two naves, which intersect in a cross, and whose upper portion, rounded into an apse, forms the choir. There are always the side aisles, for interior processions, for chapels, a sort of lateral walks or promenades where the principal nave discharges itself through the spaces between the pillars. That settled, the number of chapels, doors, bell towers, and pinnacles are modified to infinity, according to the fancy of the century, the people, and art. The service of religion once assured and provided for, architecture does what she pleases. Statues, stained glass, rose windows, arabesques, denticulations, capitals, bas-reliefs. She combines all these imaginings according to the arrangement which best suits her. Hence the prodigious exterior variety of these edifices, at whose foundation dwells so much order and unity. The trunk of a tree is immovable. The foliage is capricious. End of the chapter. Okay, this chapter was basically just a love letter. It's a love letter to the Gothic architecture. And just how architecture, specifically the Notre-Dame de Paris, Notre Dame, if we're using our Midwestern accent, the Notre Dame of Paris, how it has changed throughout the years. And the three big reasons of change are, let's see if I can remember, time, war, and the worst of all, fashions. As fashions change, things are being added to the Gothic architecture, which takes away from the beauty of the Gothic architecture. And so that's pretty much it, being like, this is the pinnacle of Gothic architecture. It's beautiful. It's so, so nice. And when you like bring it all down, like these are the different stages and the different phases that the architecture has gone through, much like all of these other churches. They have like followed in the same fashion. But the Notre Dame is the best. Is the best. Chapter 2. Well, part 1, book 3rd, chapter 2. All right. A bird's eye view of Paris. We have just attempted to restore, for the reader's benefit, that admirable church of the Notre-Dame de Paris. We have briefly pointed out the greater part of the beauties which it possessed in the 15th century, and which it lacks today. But we have omitted the principal thing, the view of Paris, which was then to be obtained from the summits of its towers. That was, in fact, when, after having long groped one's way up the dark spiral which perpendicularly pieces the thick wall of the belfries, one emerged, at last abruptly, upon one of the lofty platforms inundated with light and air. That was, in fact, a fine picture which spread out on all sides at once before the eyes a spectacle sui generis, of which those of our reader who have had the good fortune to see a Gothic city entire, complete, homogeneous, a few of which still remain, Nuremberg in Bavaria and Vittoria in Spain, can readily form an idea, or even smaller specimens, provided that they are well preserved, Vitre in Brittany, Nordhausen in Prussia. The Paris of 350 years ago, the Paris of the 15th century, was already a gigantic city. We Parisians generally make a mistake as to the ground which we think that we have gained, since Paris has not increased much over 1/3 since the time of Louis XI. It has certainly lost more in beauty than it has gained in size. Paris had its birth, as the reader knows, in that old island of the city which has formed of the cradle. The strand of that island was its first boundary wall, the river its first moat. Paris remained for many centuries in its island state, with two bridges, one on the north, the other on the south, and two bridge heads, which were at the same time its gates and its fortresses, the Grand Châtelet of the right bank, the Petit Châtelet of the left. Then, from the date of the king of the first race, Paris, being too cribbed and confined in its island, and unable to return thither, crossed the water. Then, beyond the Petit Châtelet, a first circle of walls and towers began to infringe upon the country on the two sides of the river. Some vestiges of this ancient enclosure still remained in this last century. Today, only the memory of it is left, and here and there a tradition, the Baudets or Baudoyer gate, Porta Baguada. Little by little, the tide of houses, always thrust from the heart of the city outwards, overflows, devours, wears away, and effaces this wall. Philip Augustus makes a new dike for it. He imprisons Paris in a circular chain of great towers, both lofty and solid. For the period of more than a century, the houses press upon each other, accumulate, and raise their level in this basin like water in a reservoir. They begin to deepen. They pile story upon story. They mount upon each other. They gush forth at the top like all laterally compressed growth, and there is a rivalry as to which shall thrust its head above its neighbors for the sake of getting a little air. The street glows narrower and deeper. Every space is overwhelmed and disappears. The houses finally leap the wall of Philip Augustus and scatter joyfully over the plain without order and all askew, like runaways. There they plant themselves squarely, cut themselves gardens from the fields, and take their ease. Beginning with 1367, the city spreads to such an extent into the suburbs that a new wall becomes necessary, particularly on the right bank. Charles V built it. But a city like Paris is perpetually growing. It is only such cities that become capitals. They are funnels, into which all the geographical, political, moral, and intellectual watersheds of a country, all the natural slopes of a people, pour. Wells of civilization, so to speak, and also sewers, where commerce, industry, intelligence, population, all that is sap, all that is life, all that is the soul of a nation, filters and masses unceasingly, drop by drop, century by century. So Charles V's walls suffered the fate of that of Philip Augustus. At the end of the 15th century, the Faubourg strides across it, passes beyond it, and runs farther. In the 16th, it seems to retreat visibly and to bury itself deeper and deeper in the old city, so thick had the new city already become outside it. Thus, beginning with the 15th century, where our story finds us, Paris had already outgrown the three concentric circles of walls which, from the time of Julian the Apostate, existed, so to speak, in germ in the Grand Châtelet and the Petit Châtelet. The mighty city had cracked, in succession, its four enclosures of walls, like a child grown too large for its garments of last year. Under Louis XI, this sea of houses was seen to be pierced at intervals by several groups of ruined towers, from the ancient wall, like the summits of hills in an inundation, like archipelagos of the old Paris submerged beneath the new. Since that time, Paris has undergone yet another transformation, unfortunately for our eyes, but it has passed only one more wall, that of Louis XV, that miserable wall of mud and spittle, worthy of the king who built it, worthy of the poet who sung it. Okay, good, there is a translation. It says, there's like a little line, but it says, the walling Paris makes Paris murmur. In the 15th century, Paris was still divided into three wholly distinct and separate towns, each having its own physiognomy, its own specialty, its manners, customs, privileges, and history: the city, the university, the town. The city, which occupied the island, was the most ancient and smallest, and the mother of the other two, crowded in between them, like, may we pardon the comparison, a little old woman between two large and handsome maidens. The university covered the left bank, Seine, from the Tournelle to the Tour de Nesle, points which correspond in the Paris of today. The one to the wine market, the other to the mint. Its wall included a large part of that plain where Julian had built his hot baths. The hill of Sainte-Geneviève was enclosed in it. The culminating point of this sweep of walls was the Papal Gate, that is to say, near the present site of the Pantheon. The town, which was the largest of the three fragments of Paris, held the right bank. Its quay, broken or interrupted in many places, ran along the river, from the Tour de Billy to the Tour de Bois, that is to say, from the place where the granary stands today to the present site of the Tuileries. These 4 points, where the river intersected the wall of the capital, Tournelle and the Tour de Nesle on the right, the Tour de Billy and the Tour de Bois on the left, were called preeminently the 4 towers of Paris. The town encroached still more extensively upon the fields than the university. The culminating point of the town wall, that of Charles V, was at the gates of Saint Denis and Saint Martin, whose situation has not been changed. As we have just said, each of these 3 great divisions of Paris was a town, but too special a town to be complete, a city which could not get along without the other 2. Hence, 3 entirely distinct aspects: churches abounded in the city, palaces in the town, and colleges in the university. Neglecting here the originalities of secondary importance in Old Paris, and the capricious regulations regarding the public highways, we will say, from a general point of view, taking only masses and the whole group in this chaos of communal jurisdictions, that the island belonged to the bishop, the right bank to the provost of the merchants, the left bank to the rector. Over all ruled the provost of Paris, a royal, not a municipal office. The city had Notre-Dame, the town the Louvre and the Hôtel de Ville, the university the Sorbonne. The town had the markets, the city the hospital, the university the brioche clerks. Offenses committed by the scholars on the left bank were tried in the law courts on the island and were punished on the right bank at Montfaucon, unless the rector, feeling the university to be strong and the king weak, intervened. For it was the students' privilege to be hanged on their own grounds. The greater part of these privileges, it may be noted in passing, and there were some even better than the above, had been extorted from the kings by revolts and mutinies. It is the course of things from time immemorial. The king only lets go when the people tear away. There is an old charter which puts the matter naively, apropos of fidelity. Civibus fidelitas in regis, quae tamen aliquotis sidinibus interrupta multa peperit privilegia. In the 15th century, the Seine bathed 5 islands within the walls of Paris. Louvieres Island, which there were then trees, and where there is no longer anything but wood. L'Île aux Vaches and L'Île Notre-Dame, both deserted, with the exceptions of one house, both fiefs of the bishop. In the 17th century, a single island was formed out of these two, which was built upon and named L'Île Saint-Louis. Lastly, the city, and at its point, the little islet of the cow-tender, which was afterwards engulfed beneath the platform of the Pont Neuf. The city then had 5 bridges, 3 on the right, the Pont Notre-Dame and the Pont aux Champs of stone, the Pont aux Meuniers of wood, 2 on the left, the Petit Pont of stone, the Pont Saint-Michel of wood, all loaded with houses. The university had 6 gates, built by Philip Augustus. They were, beginning with La Tournelle, the Porte Saint-Victor, the Porte Bourdelle, the Porte Papal, the Porte Saint-Jacques, the Porte Saint-Michel, the Porte Saint-Germain. The town had 6 gates, built by Charles V. Beginning with the Tour de Billy, they were the Porte Saint-Antoine, the Porte du Temple, the Porte Saint-Martin, the Porte Saint-Denis, the Porte Montmartre, the Porte Saint-Honoraire. All these gates were strong and also handsome, which does not detract from strength. A large, deep moat with a brisk current during the high water of winter bathed the base of the wall round Paris. The Seine furnished the water. At first, the gates were shut. The river was barred at both ends of the city with huge iron chains, and Paris slept tranquilly. From a bird's eye view, these 3 burghs, the city, the town, and the university, each presented to the eye an inextricable scheme of eccentrically tangled streets. Nevertheless, at first sight, one recognized the fact that these 3 fragments formed but one body. One immediately perceived 3 long parallel streets, unbroken, undisturbed, traversing almost in a straight line, all 3 cities, from one end to the other, from north to south, perpendicularly to the Seine, which bound them together, mingled them, infused them in each other, poured and transfused the people incessantly from one to the other, and made one out of the 3. The first of these streets ran from the Porte Saint-Martin. It was called the Rue Saint-Jacques in the university, Rue de la Huvière, in the city, Rue Saint-Martin in the town. It crossed the water twice, under the name of Petit Pont and the Pont Notre-Dame. The second, which was called the Rue de la Harpe on the left bank, Rue de la Barelier in the island, Rue Saint-Denis on the right bank, Pont Saint-Michel on the arm of the Seine, Pont aux Champs on the other, ran from the Porte Saint-Michel in the university to the Porte Saint-Denis in the town. However, under all these names there were but 2 streets, parent streets, generating streets, the 2 arteries of Paris. All the other veins of the triple city either derived their supply from them or emptied into them. Independently of these two principal streets, piercing Paris diametrically in its whole breadth from side to side, common to the entire capital, the city and the university had also each its own great special street, which ran lengthwise by them, parallel to the Seine, cutting, as it passed, at right angles, the two arterial thoroughfares. Thus, in the town, one descended in the straight line from the Porte Saint-Antoine to the Porte Saint-Honoré, in the university from the Porte Saint-Victor to the Porte Saint-Germain. These two great thoroughfares, intersected by the two first, formed the canvas upon which reposed, knotted, and crowded together on every hand, the labyrinth network of the streets of Paris. In the incomprehensible plan of these streets, one distinguished likewise, on looking attentively, two clusters of great streets, like magnified sheaves of grain, one in the university, the other in the town, which spread out gradually from the bridges to the gates. Some traces of this geometrical plan still exist today. Now, what aspect did this whole present when, as viewed from the summit of the towers of Notre-Dame in 1482? That we shall try to describe. For the spectator who arrived, panting, upon that pinnacle, it was first a dazzling, confusing view of roofs, chimneys, streets, bridges, places, spires, bell towers. Everything struck your eye at once: the carved gable, the pointed roof, the turrets suspended at the angles of the walls, the stone pyramids of the 11th century, the slate obelisks of the 15th, the round, bare towers of the Don John Keep, the square and fretted tower of the church, the great and the little, the massive and the aerial. The eye was, for a long time, wholly lost in this labyrinth, where there was nothing which did not possess its originality, its reason, its genius, its beauty, nothing which did not proceed from art, beginning with the smallest house, with its painted and carved front, with external beams, elliptical door, with projecting stories, to the Royal Louvre, which then had a colonnade of towers. But these are the principal masses which were then to be distinguished when the eye began to accustom itself to this tumult of edifices. In the first place, the city. The island of the city, as Sauval says, who, in spite of his confused medley, sometimes has such happy turns of expression. The island of the city is made like a great ship, stuck in the mud and run aground in the current, near the center of the Seine. We have just explained that, in the 15th century, this ship was anchored to the two banks of the river by 5 bridges. This form of a ship had also struck the heraldic scribes, for it is from that, and not from the siege by the Normans, that the ship which blazons the old shields of Paris comes, according to Favin and Pasquier. For him who understands how to decipher them, armorial bearings are algebra. Armorial bearings have a tongue. The whole history of the second half of the Middle Ages is written in armorial bearings. The first half is in the symbolism of the Roman churches. They are the hieroglyphics of feudalism, succeeding those of theocracy. Thus the city first presented itself to the eye, with its stern to the east and its prow to the west. Turning towards the prow, one had before one an innumerable flock of ancient roofs, over which arched broadly the lead-covered apse of the Sainte-Chapelle, like an elephant's haunches loaded with its tower. Only here, this tower was the most audacious, the most open, the most ornamented spire of cabinet-maker's work that ever let the sky peep through its cone of lace. In front of Notre-Dame, and very near at hand, 3 streets opened into the cathedral square, a fine square, lined with ancient houses. Over the south side of this place bent the wrinkled and sullen facade of the Hôtel Dieu, and its roof, which seemed covered with warts and pustules. Then on the right and the left, to east and west, within that wall of the city, which was yet so contracted, rose the bell towers of its 21 churches, of every date, of every form, of every size, from the low and worm-eaten belfry of Saint-Denis-du-Pas to the slender needles of Saint-Pierre-au-Boeuf and Saint-Landry. Behind Notre-Dame, the cloister and its Gothic galleries spread out towards the north. On the south, the half-Roman palace of the bishop. On the east, the desert point of the Touraine. In this throng of houses the eye also distinguished, by the lofty open-work meters of stone which then crowned the roof itself, even the most elevated windows of the palace, the hotel given by the city under Charles VI. To Juvenal d'Ursins. A little farther on, the pitch-covered sheds of the Paulus market. In still another quarter of the new apse of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, lengthened in 1458, with a bit of the Rue aux Febres, and then, in places, a square crowded with people, a pillory erected at the corner of a street, a fine fragment of the pavement of Philip Augustus, a magnificent flagging, grooved for the horses' feet, in the middle of the road, and so badly replaced in the 16th century by the miserable cobblestones called the pavement of the League, a deserted back courtyard with one of those diaphanous staircase turrets, such as were erected in the 15th century, one of which is still to be seen in the Rue des Bourbonnais. Lastly, at the right of the Sainte-Chapelle, towards the west, the Palace of Justice rested its group of towers at the edge of the water. The thickets of the King's Gardens, which covered the western point of the city, masked the island du Passeur. As for the water, from the summit of the towers of Notre-Dame one hardly saw it, on either side of the city. The Seine was hidden by bridges, the bridges by houses. And when the glance passed these bridges, whose roofs were visibly green, rendered mouldy before their time by the vapors from the water, if it was directed to the left, towards the university, the first edifice which struck it was a large, low sheaf of towers, the Petit Châtelet, whose yawning gate devoured the end of the Petit Pont. Then, if your view ran along the bank from east to west, from the Tournelle to the Tour de Nesle, there was a long cordon of houses, with carved beams, stained glass windows, each story projecting over that beneath it, in interminable zigzag of bourgeois gables, frequently interrupted by the mouth of a street, and from time to time also by the front or angle of a huge stone mansion, planted at its ease, with courts and gardens, wings and detached buildings, amid this populace of crowded and narrow houses, like a grand gentleman among a throng of rustics. There were 5 or 6 of these mansions on the quay, from the house of Lorraine, which shared with the Bernardines the grand enclosure adjoining the Tournelle, to the Hotel de Nesle, whose principal tower ended Paris, and whose pointed roofs were in a position, during 3 months of the year, to encroach, with their black triangles, upon the scarlet disk of the setting sun. This side of the Seine was, however, the least mercantile of the two. Students furnished more of a crowd and more noise there than artisans, and there was not, properly speaking, any quay, except from the Pont Saint-Michel to the Tour de Nesle. The rest of the bank of the Seine was now a naked strand, the same as beyond the Bernardines. Again, a throng of houses, standing with their feet in the water, as between the 2 bridges. There was a great uproar of laundresses. They screamed and talked and sang from morning till night along the beach, and beat a great deal of linen there, just as in our day. This is not the least of the gaieties of Paris. The university presented a dense mass to the eye. From one end to the other it was homogeneous and compact. The thousand roofs, dense, angular, clinging to each other, composed nearly all of the same geometrical element, offered, when viewed from above, the aspect of a crystallization of the same substance. The capricious ravine of streets did not cut this block of houses into two disproportionate slices. The 42 colleges were scattered about in fairly equal manner, and there were some everywhere. The amusingly varied crests of these beautiful edifices were the point of the same art as the simple roofs which they overshot, and were, actually, only a multiplication of the square or the cube of the same geometrical figure. Hence, they complicated the whole effect without disturbing it, completed without overloading it. Geometry is harmony. Some fine mansions here and there made magnificent outlines against the picturesque attics of the left bank, the house of Nevers, the house of Rome, the house of Reims, which have disappeared, the Hotel de Cluny, which still exists for the consolation of the artist, and whose tower was so stupidly deprived of its crown a few years ago. Close to the hotel, that Roman palace, with fine round arches, were once the hot baths of Julian. There were a great many abbeys, of a beauty more devout, of a grandeur more solemn than the mansions, but not less beautiful, not less grand. Those which first caught the eye were the Bernardins, which their 3 bell towers, Saint Genevieve, whose square tower, which still exists, make us regret the rest, the Sorbonne, half college, half monastery, of which so admirable a nave survives, the fine quadrilateral cloister of the Mathrons, its neighbor, the cloister of Saint Benoit, within whose walls they have had time to cobble up a theatre between the 7th and 8th editions of this book. The Cordeliers, with their 3 enormous adjacent gables, the Augustins, whose graceful spire formed, after the Tour de Nesle, the second denticulation on this side of Paris, starting from the west. The colleges, which are, in fact, the intermediate ring between the cloister and the world, hold the middle position in the monumental series between the hotels and the abbeys, with a severity full of elegance, sculpture less giddy than the palaces, and architecture less severe than the convents. Unfortunately, hardly anything remains of these monuments where Gothic art combined with so just a balance, richness, and economy. The churches, and they were numerous and splendid in the university, and they were graded, were also in all the ages of architecture, from the round arches of Saint Julian to the pointed arches of Saint Severin. The churches dominated the whole, and, like one harmony more in this mass of harmonies, they pierced in quick succession the multiple open work of the gables with slashed spires, with open work bell towers, with slender pinnacles, whose line was also a magnificent exaggeration of the acute angle of the roofs. The ground of the university was hilly. Mount Saint Genevieve formed an enormous mound to the south, and it was a sight to see from the summit of Notre-Dame how that throng of a narrow and tortuous streets, today the Latin Quarter, those bunches of houses which spread out in every direction from the top of this eminence, precipitated themselves in disorder, and almost perpendicularly down its flanks, nearly to the water's edge, having the air, some of falling, others of clambering up again, and all of holding to one another. A continual flux of 1,000 black points which passed each other on the pavement made everything move before the eyes. It was the populace seen thus from aloft and afar. Lastly, in the intervals of these roofs, of these spires, of these accidents, of the numberless edifices which bent and writhed and jagged in so eccentric a manner the extreme line of the university, one caught a glimpse, Here and there, of a great expanse of moss-grown wall, a thick, round tower, a crenellated city gate shadowing forth the fortress. It was the wall of Philip Augustus. Beyond, the fields gleamed green. Beyond, fled the roads, along which were scattered a few more suburban houses, which became more infrequent as they became more distinct. Some of these faubourgs were important. There were, first, starting from La Tournelle, the Bourg Saint Victor, with its one arch bridge over the Bieve, its abbey where one could read the epitaph of Louis le Gros, and its church with an octagonal spire, flanked with four little bell towers of the 11th century. A similar one can be seen at Etampes. It is not yet destroyed. Next, the Bourg Saint-Marcoux, which already had 3 churches and 1 convent. Then, leaving the Mill of the Goblins and its 4 white walls on the left, there was the Faubourg Saint-Jacques with the beautiful carved cross in its square, the church of Saint-Jacques du Haut Pas, which was then Gothic, pointed, charming. Saint Magloire, a fine nave of 14th century, which Napoleon turned into a haycroft. Notre-Dame des Champs, where there were Byzantine mosaics. Lastly, after having left behind full in the country, the monastery de Chartreux, a rich edifice contemporary with the Palace of Justice, with its little garden divided into compartments, and the haunted ruins of Valvor, the eye fell, to the west, upon the 3 Roman spires of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. The Bourg Saint-Germain, already a large community, formed 15 or 20 streets in the rear. The pointed bell tower of Saint-Sulpice marked one corner of the town. Close beside it, one descried the quadrilateral enclosure of the Fair of Saint-Germain, where the market is situated today. Then the abbot's pillory, a pretty little round tower, well capped, with a leaden cone. The brickyard was further on, and the Rue de Four, which led to the common bakehouse, and the mill on its hillock, and the lazar house, a tiny house, isolated and half seen. But that which attracted the eye most of all and fixed it for a long time on that point was the abbey itself. It is certain that this monastery, which had a grand air, both as a church and as a seigneury, that abbatical place where the bishops of Paris counted themselves happy if they could pass the night, that refectory upon which the architect had bestowed the air, the beauty, and the rose window of the cathedral, that elegant chapel of the Virgin, that monumental dormitory, those vast gardens, that portcullis, that drawbridge, that envelope of battlements which notched to the eye the verdure of the surrounding meadows, those courtyards, where gleamed men at arms intermingled with golden copse, the whole grouped and clustered about 3 lofty spires, with round arches, well planted upon a Gothic apse, made a magnificent figure against the horizon. When, at length, after having contemplated the university for a long time, you turned toward the right bank, toward the town, the character of the spectacle was abruptly altered. The town, in fact much larger than the university, was also less of a unit. At first glance, one saw that it was divided into many masses, singularly distinct. First, to the eastward, in that part of the town which still makes its name from the marsh where Camoëns entangled Caesar with a pile of palaces. The block extended to the very water's edge. 4 almost contiguous hotels, Jouy, Sens, Barbeau, the house of the Queen, mirrored their slate peaks, broken with slender turrets, in the Seine. These four edifices filled the space from the Rue des Nonandières to the Abbey of the Celestines, whose spire gracefully relieved their lines of gables and battlements. A few miserable greenish hovels hanging over the water in front of these sumptuous hotels did not prevent one from seeing the fine angles of their facades, their large, square windows with stone mullions, their pointed porches overloaded with statues, the vivid outlines of their walls, always clear-cut, and all those charming accidents of architecture which cause Gothic art to have the air of beginning its combinations afresh with every monument. Behind these palaces extended in all directions, now broken, fenced in, battlemented like a citadel, now veiled by great trees like a Carthusian convent, the immense and multiform enclosure of that miraculous Hotel de Saint-Paul, where the King of France possessed the means of lodging superbly 22 princes of the rank of the Dauphin and the Duke of Burgundy, with their domestics and their suites, without continuing the great lords and the emperor when he came to view Paris, and the lions, who had their separate hotel at the Royal Hotel. Let us say here that a prince's apartment was then composed of never less than 11 large rooms, from the chamber of state to the oratory, not to mention the galleries, baths, paper house, and other superfluous places with which each apartment was provided, not to mention the private gardens for each of the king's guests, not to mention the kitchens, the cellars, the domestic offices, the general refectories of the house, the poultry yards, where there were 22 general laboratories, from the bakehouses to the wine cellars, games of 1,000 sorts, malls, tennis, and riding at the ring, aviaries, fish ponds, menageries, stables, barns, libraries, arsenals, and foundries. This was what the king's palace, a Louvre, a Hotel de Saint-Paul was then, a city within a city. From the tower where we are placed, the Hotel Saint-Paul, almost half hidden by the four great houses of which we have just spoken, was still very considerable and very marvelous to see. One could there distinguish very well, though cleverly united by the principal building by long galleries, decked with painted glass and slender columns, the 3 hotels which Charles V had amalgamated with his palace, the Hotel du Petit Mousse, with the airy balustrade which formed a graceful border to its roof, the Hotel of the Abbey de Saint-Maur, having the vanity of a stronghold, a great tower, machicolations, loopholes, iron gratings, and over the large Saxon door the armorial bearings of the abbey. Between the 2 mortices of the drawbridge, the Hotel of the Comte de Hunt, whose donjon keep, ruined in its summit, was rounded and notched like a cock's comb. Here and there 3 or 4 ancient oaks, forming a tuft together like enormous cauliflowers, gambols of swans, in the clear water of the fish ponds, all in folds of light and shade. Many courtyards of which one beheld picturesque bits. The Hotel of the Lions, with its low, pointed arches on short Saxon pillars, its iron gratings and its perpetual roar, shooting up above the whole, the scale-ornamented spire of the Ave Maria. On the left, the house of the Provost of Paris, flanked by 4 small towers, delicately grooved in the middle at the extremity. The Hotel Saint-Paul, properly speaking, with its multiplied facades, its successive enrichments from the time of Charles V, the hybrid excrescences with which the fancy of the architects had loaded it during the last 2 centuries, with all the apse of its chapels, all the gables of its galleries, 1,000 weathercocks from the 4 winds, and its 2 lofty contiguous towers, whose conical roof, surrounded by battlements at its base, looked like those pointed caps which have their edges turned up. Continuing to mount, the stories of this amphitheater of palaces spread out afar upon the ground, after crossing a deep ravine hollowed out of the roofs in the town, which marked the passage of the Rue Saint Antoine. The eye reached the house of Angoulême, a vast construction of many epochs, where there were perfectly new and very white parts, which melted no better into the whole than a red patch on a blue doublet. Nevertheless, the remarkably pointed and lofty roof of the modern palace, bristling with carved eaves, covered with sheets of lead, where coiled 1,000 fantastic arabesques of sparkling incrustations, of gilded bronze, that roof, so curiously damascened, darted upwards gracefully from the midst of the brown ruins of the ancient edifice, whose huge and ancient towers, rounded by age like casks, sinking together with old age and rending themselves from top to bottom, resembled great bellies unbuttoned. Behind rose the forest of spires of the Palace des Tournelles. Not a view in the world, either at Chambord or at the Alhambra, is more magic, more aerial, more enchanting than that thicket of spires, tiny bell towers, chimneys, weather vanes, winding staircases, lanterns through which the daylight makes its way, which seems cut out at a blow, pavilions, spindle-shaped turrets, or, as they were then called, tournelles, all differing in form, in height, and attitude. One would have pronounced it a gigantic stone chessboard. To the right of the tournelles, that truss of enormous towers, black as ink, running into each other and tied, as it were, by a circular moat, that donjon keep, much more pierced with loopholes than with windows, that drawbridge, always raised, that portcullis, always lowered, is the Bastille. Those sorts of black beaks which project from between the battlements, and which you take from a distance to be cave spouts, are cannons. Beneath them, at the foot of the formidable edifice, behold the Porte Saint-Antoine, both buried between its two towers. Beyond the Tournelle, as far as the wall of Charles V, spread out with rich compartments of verdure and of flowers, a velvet carpet of cultivated land and royal parks, in the midst of which one recognized, by its labyrinth of trees and alleys, the famous Daedalus garden which Louis XI had given to Coquetier. The doctor's observatory rose above the labyrinth like a great isolated column, with a tiny house for a capital. Terrible astrologies took place in that laboratory. There today is the Place Royale. As we have just said, the quarter of the palace, of which we have just endeavored to give the reader some idea by indicating only the chief points, filled the angle with Charles V's wall made with the Seine on the east. The center of the town was occupied by a pile of houses for the populace. It was there, in fact, that the 3 bridges disgorged upon the right bank. The bridges lead to the buildings of houses rather than palaces. That congregation of bourgeois habitations, pressed together like the cells in a hive, had a beauty of its own. It is with the roofs of a capital as with the waves of the sea. They are grand. First, the streets, crossed and entangled, forming 100 amusing figures in the block, around the marketplace. It was like a star with 1,000 rays. The Rue Saint-Denis and Saint-Martin, with their innumerable ramifications, rose one after the other, like trees intertwining their branches. And then the tortuous lines, the Rue de la Patrie, de la meandered all over. They were also fine edifices which pierced the petrified undulations of that sea of gables, at the head of the Pont aux Changeurs, behind which one beheld the Seine foaming beneath the wheels of the Pont aux Meuniers. There was the Châtelet, no longer a Roman tower, as under Julian the Apostate, but a feudal tower of the 13th century, and of a stone so hard that the pickaxe could not break away so much as the thickness of the fist in a space of 3 hours. There was the rich square bell tower of Saint Jacques de la Bouchière, with its angles all frothing with carvings, already admirable, although it was not finished in the 15th century. It lacked, in particular, the 4 monsters, which, still perched today on the corners of its roof, have the air of so many sphinxes who are propounding to New Paris the riddle of the ancient Paris. Rault, the sculptor, only placed them in position in 1526, and received 20 francs for his pains. There was the Maison Empilière, the Pillar House, opening upon that Place de Grève, of which we have given the reader some idea. There was Saint Gervais, of which a front in good taste has since spoiled. Saint Mere, whose ancient pointed arches were still almost round arches. Saint Jean, whose magnificent spire was proverbial. There were 20 other monuments which did not disdain to bury their wonders in that chaos of black, deep, narrow streets. Add the crosses of carved stone more lavishly scattered through the squares than ever into gibbets, the cemetery of the Innocents, whose architectural wall could be seen in the distance above the roofs, the pillory of the markets, whose top was visible between 2 chimneys of Rue de la Cossonnerie, the latter of the Croix de Trahau, in its square always black with people, the circular buildings of the Wheat Mart, the fragment of Philip Augustus's ancient wall, which could be made out here and there, drowned among the houses, its towers gnawed by ivy, its gates in ruin with crumbling and deformed stretches of wall, the quay with its 1,000 shops, and its bloody knacker's yard, the Seine encumbered with boats from Port au Foin to, and you have a confused picture of what the central trapezium of the town was like in 1482. With these 2 quarters, one of hotels and the other of houses, the third feature of aspect presented by the city was a long zone of abbeys, which bordered it in nearly the whole of its circumference, from the rising to the setting sun, and behind the circle of fortifications which hemmed in Paris, formed a second interior enclosure of convents and chapels. Thus, immediately adjoining the Parc des Tournelles, between the Rue Saint-Antoine and the Rue du Temple, there stood Saint Catherine, with its immense cultivated lands, which were terminated only by the wall of Paris. Between the old and the new Rue du Temple there was the Temple, a sinister group of towers, lofty, erect, and isolated in the middle of a vast, battlemented enclosure. Between the Rue Neuve du Temple and the Rue Saint-Martin there was the Abbey of Saint-Martin in the midst of its gardens, a superb fortified church, whose girdle of towers, whose diadem of bell towers, yielded in force and splendor only to Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Between the Rue Saint-Martin and the Rue Saint-Denis spread the enclosure of the Trinity. Lastly, between the Rue Saint-Denis and the Rue Montorgueil stood the Fil-Dieu. On one side, the rotting roofs and unpaved enclosure of the Court of Miracles could be descried. It was the sole profane ring which was linked to that devout chain of convents. Finally, the 4th compartment, which stretched itself out in the agglomeration of the roofs on the right bank, and which occupied the western angle of the enclosure and the banks of the river downstream, was a fresh cluster of palaces and hotels placed close about the base of the Louvre. The old Louvre of Philip Augustus, that immense edifice whose great tower rallied about it 23 chief towers, not to reckon the lesser towers, seemed from a distance to be enshrined in the Gothic roofs of the Hotel d'Alençon and the Petit Bourbon. This hydra of towers, giant guardian of Paris, with its 24 heads always erect, with its monstrous haunches, loaded or scaled with slates, and all streaming with metallic reflections, terminated, with wonderful effect, the configuration of the town towards the west. Thus, an immense block, which the Romans called insula, or island, of bourgeois houses, flanked on the right and the left by 2 blocks of palaces crowned, and one by the Louvre, the other by the Tournelle, bordered on the north by a long girdle of abbeys and cultivated enclosures, all amalgamated and melted together in one view upon these thousands of edifices, whose tiled and slated roofs outlined upon each other so many fantastic chains, the bell towers, tattooed, fluted, and ornamented with twisted bands of the 44 churches on the right bank, myriads of cross streets, for boundary on one side, an enclosure of lofty walls with square towers, that of the university had round towers. On the other, the Seine, cut by bridges, and bearing on its bosom a multitude of boats, behold the town of Paris in the 15th century. Beyond the walls, several suburban villages pressed close about the gates, but less numerous and more scattered than those of the university. Behind the Bastille there were 20 hovels clustered round the curious sculptures of the Croix Faubine and the flying buttresses of the Abbey of Saint Antoine de Champs. Then Popincourt, lost amid wheat fields. Then La Courtielle, a merry village of wine shops, the hamlet of Saint Laurent, with its church whose bell towers, from afar, seemed to aid itself to the pointed tower of the Pont Saint Martin, the Faubourg Saint Denis, with the vast enclosure of Saint Ladre, beyond the Montmartre gate, the Grand Batelliere, encircled with white walls, behind it with its chalky slopes, Montmartre, which had then almost as many churches as windmills, and which has kept only the windmills, for society no longer demands anything but bread for the body. Lastly, beyond the Louvre, the Faubourg Saint-Honoré, already considerable at that time, could be seen stretching away into the fields, and Petit Breton gleaming green, and the Marche aux Pourceaux spreading abroad, in whose centre swelled the horrible apparatus used for boiling counterfeiters. Between La Courtille and Saint Laurent, your eye had already noticed, on the summit of an eminence crouching amid desert plains, a sort of edifice which resembled from a distance a ruined colonnade, mounted upon a basement with its foundation laid bare. This was neither a Parthenon, nor a temple of the Olympian Jupiter. It was Montfaucon. Now, if the enumeration of so many edifices, summary as we have endeavored to make it, has not shattered in the reader's mind the general image of old Paris, as we have constructed it, we will recapitulate it in a few words. In the center, the island of the city, resembling as to form an enormous tortoise, and throwing out its bridges with tiles for scales, like legs from beneath its grey shell of roofs. On the left, the monolithic trapezium, firm, dense, bristling, of the university. On the right, the vast semicircle of the town, much more intermixed with gardens and monuments. The 3 blocks, city, university, and town, marbled with innumerable streets. Across all, the Seine, foster mother Seine, as says Father Dubreuil, blocked with islands, bridges, and boats. All about an immense plain, patched with 1,000 sorts of cultivated plots, sown with fine villages. On the left, Issy, Benvers, Montgros, Gentilly, with its round tower and its square tower, etc. On the right, 20 others from Conflans to some others. On the horizon, a border of hills arranged in a circle like the rim of the basin. Finally, far away to the east, Vincennes and its 7 quadrangular towers to the south, Bicêtre and its pointed turrets to the north, Saint-Denis and its spire to the west, St. Cloud and its donjon keep. Such was the Paris which the ravens, who lived in 1482, beheld from the summits of the towers of Notre-Dame. Nevertheless, Voltaire said of the city that before Louis XIV it possessed but 4 fine monuments: the dome of the Sorbonne, the Val de Grace, the modern Louvre, and I know not what the 4th was, the Luxembourg, perhaps. Fortunately, Voltaire was the author of Candide. In spite of this, and in spite of this, he is, among all the men who have followed each other in the long series of humanity, the one who has best possessed the diabolical laugh. Moreover, this proves that one can be a fine genius and yet understand nothing of an art to which one does not belong. Did Molière imagine that he was doing Raphael and Michelangelo a great honor by calling them those mignards of their age? Let us return to Paris and to the 15th century. It was not then merely a handsome city. It was a homogeneous city, an architectural and historical product of the Middle Ages, a chronicle in stone. It was a city formed of 2 layers only, the Romanesque layer and the Gothic layer. For the Roman layer had disappeared long before, and with the exception of the hot baths of Julian, where it still pierced through the thick crust of the Middle Ages. As for the Celtic layer, no specimens were any longer to be found, even when sinking wells. 50 years later, when the Renaissance began to mingle with this unity which was so severe and yet so varied, the dazzling luxury of its fantasies and systems, its debasements of Roman round arches, Greek columns, and Gothic bases, its sculpture which was so tender and so ideal, its peculiar taste for arabesques and acanthus leaves, its architectural paganism, contemporary with Luther, Paris was, perhaps, still more beautiful, although less harmonious to the eye and to the thought. But this splendid moment lasted only for a short time. The Renaissance was not impartial. It did not content itself with building. It wished to destroy. It is true that it required the room. Thus Gothic Paris was complete only for a moment. Saint Jacques had barely been completed when the demolition of the old Louvre was begun. After that, the great city became more disfigured every day. Gothic Paris, beneath which Roman Paris was effaced in its turn. But can anyone say what Paris has replaced it? There is the Paris of Catherine de Medici, the Paris of Henry II, at the Hôtel de Ville, 2 edifices still in fine taste, the Paris of Henry IV, at the Palace Royal, facades of brick with stone corners and slated roofs, tricolored houses, the Paris of Louis XIII, a crushed and squat architecture with vaults like basket handles, and something indescribably pot-bellied in the column, the thick set in the dome, the Paris of Louis XIV, in the Invalides, grand, rich, gilded, cold, the Paris of Louis XV, in Saint Sulpice, volutes, knots of ribbon, clouds, vermicelli, and chicory leaves, all in stone, the Paris of Louis XVI, in the Pantheon, St. Peter of Rome badly copied, the edifice is awkwardly heaped together, which has not amended its lines, the Paris of the Republic, in the School of Medicine, a poor Greek and Roman taste, which resembles the Colosseum or the Parthenon as the Constitution of the year 3. Resembles the law of Minos. It is called in architecture the Messidor, taste. The Paris of Napoleon of the Place Vendôme, this one is sublime, a column of bronze made of cannons. The Paris of Restoration at the Bourse, a very white colonnade supporting a very smooth frieze. The whole is square and cost 20 millions. To each of these characteristic monuments there is attached by a similarity of taste, fashion, and attitude, a certain number of houses scattered about in different quarters, and which the eyes of the connoisseur easily distinguishes and furnishes with a date. When one knows how to look, one finds the spirit of a century, and the physiognomy of a king, even in the knocker on a door. The Paris of the present day has, then, no general physiognomy. It is a collection of specimens of many centuries, and the finest have disappeared. The capital grows only in houses, and what houses! At the rate at which Paris is now proceeding, it will renew itself every 50 years. Thus, a historical significance of its architecture is being effaced every day. Monuments are becoming rarer and rarer, and one seems to see them gradually engulfed by the flood of houses. Our fathers had a Paris of stone. Our sons will have one of plaster. So far as the modern monuments of New Paris are concerned, we would gladly be excused from mentioning them. It is not that we do not admire them as they deserve. The Sainte Geneviève of Monsieur Soufflot is certainly the finest Savoy cake that has ever been made in stone. The Palace of the Legion of Honor is also a very distinguished bit of pastry. The dome of the Wheat Market is an English jockey cap on a grand scale. The towers of Saint Sulpice are two huge clarinets, and the form is as good as any other. The telegraph, contorted and grimacing, forms an admirable accident upon their roofs. Saint Roch has a door which, for magnificence, is comparable only to that of Saint Thomas d'Aquin. It has also a crucifixion in high relief in a cellar, with a sun of gilded wood. These things are fairly marvelous. The lantern of the labyrinth of the Jardin des Plantes is also very ingenious. As for the palace of the Bourse, which is Greek as to its colonnade, Roman in the round arches of its door and windows, of the Renaissance by virtue of its flattened vault, it is indubitably a very correct and very pure monument. The proof is that it is crowned with an attic, such as was never seen in Athens, a beautiful, straight line, gracefully broken here and there by stovepipes. Let us add that if it is according to rule that the architecture of a building should be adapted to its purposes in such a manner that this purpose shall be immediately apparent from the mere aspect of the building, one cannot be too much amazed at a structure which might be indifferently the palace of a king, a chamber of communes, a town hall, a college, a riding school, an academy, a warehouse, a courthouse, a museum, a barracks, a sepulchre, a temple, or a theater. However, it is in exchange. An edifice ought to be, moreover, suitable to the climate. This one is evidently constructed expressly for our cold and rainy skies. It has a roof almost as flat as roofs in the East, which involves sweeping the roof in winter when it snows, and of course roofs are made to be swept. As for its purpose, of which we just spoke, it fulfills it to a marvel. It is a Bourse of France, as it would have been a temple in Greece. It is true that the architect was at a good deal of trouble to conceal the clock face, which would have destroyed the purity of the fine lines of the facade, but, on the other hand, we have that colonnade which circles round the edifice, and under which, on days of high religious ceremony, the theories of the stockbrokers and the courtiers of commerce can be developed so majestically. There are very superb structures. Let us add a quantity of fine, amusing, and varied streets, like the Rue de Rivoli, and I do not despair of Paris presenting to the eye, when viewed from a balloon, that richness of line, that opulence of detail, that diversity of aspect, that grandiose something in the simple, and unexpected in the beautiful, which characterizes the checkerboard. However, admirable as the Paris of today may seem to you, reconstruct the Paris of the 15th century, call it up before you in thought. Look at the sky athwart that surprising forest of spires, towers, and belfries, spread out in the center of the city, tear away at the point of the islands, fold at the arches of the bridges, the Seine with its broad green and yellow expanses, more variable than the skin of a serpent, project clearly against an azure horizon the Gothic profile of this ancient Paris. Make its contour float in a winter's mist which clings to its numerous chimneys. Drown it in profound night and watch the odd play of lights and shadows in that somber labyrinth of edifices. Cast upon it a ray of light which shall vaguely outline it and cause to emerge from the fog the great heads of the towers, or take that black silhouette again, enliven with shadow the thousand acute angles of the spires and gables, and make it start out more toothed than a shark's jaw against a copper-colored western sky. And then compare. And if you wish to receive of the ancient city an impression with which the modern one can no longer furnish you, climb. On the morning of some grand festival beneath the rising sun of the Easter or of Pentecost, climb upon some elevated point whence you command the entire capital, and be present at the wakening of the chimes. Behold, at a signal given from heaven, for it is the sun which gives it, all those churches quiver simultaneously. First come scattered strokes, running from one church to another, as when musicians give warning that they are about to begin. Then, all at once, behold. For it seems at times as though the ear also possessed a sight of its own. Behold, rising from each bell tower, something like a column of sound, a cloud of harmony. First, the vibration of each bell mounts straight upwards, pure and, so to speak, isolated from the others, into the splendid morning sky. Then, little by little as they swell, they melt together, mingle, are lost in each other, and amalgamate in a magnificent concert. It is no longer anything but a mass of sonorous vibrations incessantly sent forth from the numerous belfries, floats, undulates, bounds, whirls over the city, and prolongs, far beyond the horizon, the deafening circle of its oscillations. Nevertheless, this sea of harmony is not a chaos, great and profound as it is. It has not lost its transparency. You behold the windings of each group of notes which escape from the belfries. You can follow the dialogue, by turns grave and shrill, of the treble and the bass. You can see the octaves leap from one tower to another. You watch them spring forth, winged, light, and whistling from the silver bell, to fall, broken and limping from the bell of wood. You admire in their midst the rich gamut which incessantly ascends and reascends the 7 bells of St. Eustace. You see light and rapid notes running across it, executing 3 or 4 luminous zigzags and vanishing like flashes of lightning. Yonder is the Abbey of St. Martin, a shrill, cracked singer. Hear the gruff and gloomy voice of the Bastille. At the other end, the great tower of the Louvre, with its bass. The royal chime of the palace scatters on all sides, and without relaxation, resplendent trills, upon which fall, at regular intervals, the heavy strokes from the belfry of Notre-Dame, which makes them sparkle like the anvil under the hammer. At intervals you behold the passage of sounds of all forms which come from the triple peal of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Then, again, from time to time this mass of sublime noises opens and gives passage to the beats of the Ave Maria, which bursts forth and sparkles like an agate of stars. Below, in the very depths of the concert, you confusedly distinguish the interior chanting of the churches, which exhales through the vibrating pores of their vaulted roofs. Assuredly, this is an opera which it is worth the trouble of listening to. Ordinarily, the noise which escapes from Paris by day is the city speaking; by night, it is the city breathing. In this case, it is the city singing. Lend an ear, then, to this concert of bell towers. Spread over all the murmur of 500,000 men the eternal plaint of the river, the infinite breathing of the wind, the grave and distant quartet of the four forests arranged upon the hills, on the horizon, like immense stacks of organ pipes, extinguish, as in a half-shade, all that is too hoarse and too shrill about the central chime, and say whether you know anything in the world more rich and joyful, more golden, more dazzling than this tumult of bells and chimes, than this furnace of music, than these 10,000 brazen voices chanting simultaneously in the flutes of stone, 300 feet high, than this city which is no longer anything but an orchestra, than this symphony which produces the noise of the tempest. End of the chapter and end of book 3. My gosh. Oh, oh my, oh my, oh my. All right, that chapter was just a very, very, very long love note to architecture and also going through the history and the city's organization. But isn't it pretty? It is just so wild that Hugo gets away with being able to have a story with a plot, with characters, and then just throws in all of this like extra context about whatever it is. This one not always being political, a little bit of politics in there, but about just, time passing and how things have changed and how meanings have changed and things like that. And it's just wild. It is wild. Mm-mm-mm. Most of the book is nothing but a description of medieval Paris. Yes. Like Quasimodo, Esmeralda, they're like this much of the story. This much. Everything else, buildings. We're getting back to characters in these next couple, so that's cool. Part 1, book 4th, chapter 1. Good souls. 16 years previous to the epoch when this story takes place, one fine morning, on Quasimodo Sunday, a living creature had been deposited, after Mass, in the church of Notre-Dame. On the wooden bed securely fixed in the vestibule on the left, opposite that great image of Saint Christopher, which the figure of Monsieur Antoine Desarts, Chevalier, carved in stone, had been gazing at on his knees since 1413, when they took it into their heads to overthrow the saint and the faithful follower. Upon this bed of wood it was customary to expose foundlings for public charity. Whoever cared to take them did so. In front of the wooden bed was a copper basin for alms. The sort of living being which lay upon that plank on the morning of Quasimodo, in the year of the Lord 1467, appeared to excite to a high degree the curiosity of the numerous group which had congregated about the wooden bed. The group was formed, for the most part, for the fair sex. Hardly anyone was there except old women. In the first row, and among those who were most bent over the bed, 4 were noticeable, who, from their grey cudgel, a sort of sack, were recognizable as attached to some devout sisterhood. I do not see why history has not transmitted to posterity the names of these 4 discreet and venerable damsels. They were Agnes La Hermie, Jehanne de la Tarme, Henrietta, Gauchier, La Violette. All 4 widows, all 4 dames of the chapel Haudry, who had quitted their house with the permission of their mistress, and in conformity with the statutes of Pierre Daly, in order to come and hear the sermon. However, if these good Haudriettes were, for the moment, complying with the statutes of Pierre Daly, They certainly violated with joy those of Michel de Broche and the Cardinal of Pisa, which so inhumanly enjoined silence upon them. "What is this, sister?" said Agnes to Gaucher, gazing at the little creature exposed, who was screaming and writhing on the wooden bed, terrified by so many glances. "What is to become of us," said Jehan, "if that is the way children are made now?" "I am not learned in the matter of children," resumed Agnes, "but it must be a sin to look at this one." "'Tis not a child, Agnes." "'Tis a monkey," remarked Gaucher. "'Tis a miracle," interposed Henriette. "Then it is the third since the Sunday of the Lothaire, for in less than a week we had a miracle of the mocker of pilgrims divinely punished by Notre-Dame, and that was the second miracle within a month. This pretended foundling is a real monster of abomination," resumed Jehan. "He yells loud enough to deafen a chanter," continued Gaucher. "Hold your tongue, you little howler." "To think that Monsieur of Rheims sent this enormity to Monsieur of Paris," added Gautier, clasping her hands. "I imagine," said Agnes, "that it is a beast, an animal, the fruit of a Jew and a sow, something not Christian, in sort, which ought to be thrown into the fire or into the water." "I really hope," resumed Gautier, "that nobody will apply for it." "Oh, good heavens!" exclaimed Agnes, "those poor nurses yonder in the foundling asylum, which forms the lower end of the lane as you go to the river, just beside Monseigneur the Bishop. What if this little monster were to be carried to them to suckle? I'd rather give suck to a vampire." "How innocent that poor little La Hermée is," resumed Jehan. "Don't you see, sister, that this little monster is at least 4 years old, and that he would have less appetite for your breast than for a turnspit?" The little monster, we should find it difficult ourselves to describe him otherwise, was, in fact, not a newborn child. It was a very angular and a very lively little mass, imprisoned in its linen sack, stamped with the cipher of Messieurs Guamet, Cartier, then Bishop of Paris, with a head projecting. That head was deformed enough. One beheld only a forest of red hair, one eye, a mouth, and teeth. The eye wept, the mouth cried, and the teeth seemed to ask only to be allowed to bite. The whole struggled in the sack, to the great consternation of the crowd, which increased and was renewed incessantly around it. Dame Eloise, a rich and noble woman, who held by the hand a pretty girl about 5 or 6 years of age, and dragged a long veil about, suspended to the golden horn of her headdress, halted as she passed the wooden bed, and gazed for a moment at the wretched creature, while her charming little daughter, Fleur de Lis, spelled out with her tiny, pretty finger the permanent inscription attached to the wooden bed: "Foundlings." "Really," said the dame, turning away in disgust, "I thought that they only exposed children here." She turned her back, throwing into the basin a silver florin, which rang among the lyres, and made the poor good wives of the chapel of Hawtrey open their eyes. A moment later, the grave and learned Robert Mistricolle, the king's protonotary, passed with an enormous missal under one arm and his wife on the other, Damsel Guillemette La Mercière, having thus by his side his 2 regulars, spiritual and temporal. "Foundling," he said, after examining the object, "found, apparently, on the banks of the river Phlegethon." "One can only see one eye," observed Demoiselle. "There is a wart on the other." "It is not a wart," returned Master Robert. "It is an egg which contains another demon exactly similar, who bears another little egg which contains another demon, and so on." "Well, how do you know that?" asked Guillemette. "I know it pertinently," replied the protonotary. "Monsieur le promoteur," asked Gauche, "what do you prognosticate of this pretended foundling?" "The greatest misfortunes," replied Mr. Kroll. "Oh, good heavens!" said an old woman among the spectators, "and that besides our having had a considerable pestilence last year, and that they say that the English are going to disembark in a company at Harfleur." "Perhaps that will prevent the Queen from coming to Paris in the month in September," interposed another. "Trade is so bad already." "My opinion is," exclaimed Johann, "that it would be better for the louts of Paris if this little magician were put to bed on a plank." "A flaming torch," added the old woman. "It would be more prudent," said Mr. Cole. For several minutes a young priest had been listening to the reasoning of the Hodrits and the sentences of the notary. He had a severe face, with a large brow, a profound glance. He thrust the crowd silently aside, scrutinized the little magician, and stretched out his hand upon it. It was high time, for all the devotees were already licking their chops over the fine, flaming steak. "I adopt this child," said the priest. He took it in his cassock and carried it off. The spectators followed him with frightened glances. A moment later, he had disappeared through the red door, which then led to the church, to the cloister. When the first surprise was over, Jehan bent down to the ear of La Gautière. "I told you, sister, that young clerk, Monsieur Claude Frollo, is a sorcerer." End of the chapter. Very short chapter. We just get what I'm assuming is Quasimodo being dropped off outside of a church for sanctuary and to be like taken in from somewhere, don't know where, but these passing nuns are like, "Oh, disgusting, would never, could never," and even children are like, "Ew, oh, gross, he's not even a kid, or not even a baby, can you do that? Like, it's not a real foundling." And then Claude Frollo is like, "Hey, I will take this child." And that's it. That was that chapter. Very short, very quick. Let's do one more chapter. All right. First, part 1, book 4th, chapter 2. Claude Frollo. In fact, Claude Frollo was no common person. He belonged to one of those middle-class families which were called indifferently, in the impertinent language of the last century, the high bourgeois, or the petty nobility. This family had inherited from the brothers Paclet the fief of Tereshap, which was dependent upon the Bishop of Paris, and whose 21 houses had been in the 13th century the object of so many suits before the official. As possessor of this fief, Claude was one of the 27 seigneurs keeping claim to a manor in a fee in Paris and its suburbs, and for a long time his name was to be seen inscribed in this quality between the Hotel de Tancarville, belonging to Master Francois Lerez, and the College of Tours, in the records deposited at Saint Martin de Champs. Claude Frollo had been destined from infancy by his parents to the ecclesiastical profession. He had been taught to read in Latin. He had been trained to keep his eyes on the ground and to speak low. While still a child, his father had cloistered him in the College of Torchi in the university. There it was that he had grown up on the Missal and the Lexicon. Moreover, he was a sad, grave, serious child, who studied ardently and learned quickly. He never uttered a loud cry in recreation hour, mixed but little in the bacchanals of the Rue de Forêt, did not know what it was to dare à la passe et capillos laniare, you and me both, and had cut no figure in that revolt in 1463, which the annalists register gravely under the title of the sixth trouble of the university. He seldom rallied the poor students of Montaigu on the capets from which they derived their name, or the bursars of the College of Dormans on their shaved tonsure, and their surtout party-coloured of bluish green, blue and violet cloth, as says the charter of the Cardinal de Quatre-Cornes. On the other hand, he was assiduous at the great and the small schools of the Rue Saint-Jean-de-Beauvais, the first pupil whom the Abbé de Saint-Pierre de Val, at the moment of beginning his reading on canon law, always perceived, glued to a pillar of the school Saint Vendregestel, opposite his rostrum, was Claude Frollo, armed with his horn ink bottle, biting his pen, scribbling on his threadbare knee, and, in winter, blowing on his fingers. The first auditor whom Monsieur Miles de Delicier, doctor in decretals, saw arrive every Monday morning, all breathless, at the opening of the gates of the school of Chef Saint-Denis, was Claude Frollo. Thus, at 16 years of age, the young clerk might have held his own in mystical theology against a father of the church in canonical theology, against a father of the consuls in scholastic theology, against a doctor of Sorbonne. Theology conquered, he had plunged into decretals. From the master of sentences he had passed to the capitularies of Charlemagne, and he had devoured in succession, in his appetite for science, decretals upon decretals, those of Theodore, Bishop of Haspelus, those of Bouchard, Bishop of Worms, those of Yves, Bishop of Chartres, next the decretal of Gratian, which succeeded the capitularies of Charlemagne, then the collection of Gregory IX., then the epistle of Superspecula of Honorius III. He rendered clear and familiar to himself that vast and tumultuous period of civil law and canon law in conflict and at strife with each other in the chaos of the Middle Ages, a period which Bishop Theodore opens in 618, and which Pope Gregory closes in 1227. Decretals digested, he flung himself upon medicine, on the liberal arts. He studied the science of herbs, the science of unguents. He became an expert in fevers and contusions, in sprains and abscesses. Jacques Desparres would have received him as a physician, Richard Hellayne as a surgeon. He also passed through all the degrees of licentiate, master, and doctor of arts. He studied the languages, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, a triple sanctuary, then very little frequented. He was a veritable fever for acquiring and hoarding in the matter of science. At the age of 18, he had made his way through the 4 faculties. It seemed to be the young man that life had but one sole object: learning. It was toward this epoch that the excessive heat of the summer of 1466 caused that grand outburst of the plague which carried off more than 40,000 souls in the Vicomte of Paris, and among others, as Jean de Troyes states, Master Arnauld, astrologer to the king, who was a very fine man, both wise and pleasant. The rumor spread in the university that the Rue Tirechampn was especially devastated by the malady. It was there that Claude's parents resided, in the midst of their fief. The young scholar rushed in great alarm to the paternal mansion. When he entered it, he found that both father and mother had died on the preceding day. A very young brother of his, who was in swaddling clothes, was still alive, and crying abandoned in his cradle. This was all that remained, to Claude, of his family. The young man took the child under his arm and went off in a pensive mood. Up to that moment, he had lived only in science. He now began to live in life. This catastrophe was a crisis in Claude's existence. Orphaned, the eldest, head of the family at the age of 19, he felt himself rudely recalled from the reveries of school to the realities of this world. Then, Moved with pity, he was seized with passion and devotion towards that child, his brother. A sweet and strange thing was a human affection to him who had hitherto loved his book alone. This affection developed to a singular point, in a soul so new, it was like a first love, separated since infancy from his parents, whom he had hardly known, cloistered and immured, as it were, in his books, eager above all things to study and to learn, exclusively attentive up to that time to his intelligence which broadened in science, to his imagination which expanded in letters. The poor scholar had not yet had time to feel the place of his heart. This young brother, without mother or father, this little child, which had fallen abruptly from heaven into his arms, made a new man of him. He perceived that there was something else in the world besides the speculations of the Sorbonne and the verses of Homer, that man needed affections, that life without tenderness and without love was only a set of dry, shrieking, and rending wheels. Only, he imagined, for he was at the age when illusions are as yet replaced only by illusions, that the affections of blood and family were the sole ones necessary, and that a little brother to love sufficed to fill an entire existence. He threw himself, therefore, into the love for his little Jihan with the passion of a character already profound, ardent, concentrated. That poor, frail creature, pretty, fair-headed, rosy, and curly, that orphan, with another orphan for his only support, touched him to the bottom of his heart. The grave thinker as he was, he set to meditating upon Jihan with an infinite compassion. He kept watch and ward over him as over something very fragile and very worthy of care. He was more than a brother to the child. He became a mother to him. Then little Jihan had lost his mother while he was still at the breast. Claude gave him to a nurse. Besides the fief of Terre-Shop, he had inherited from his father the fief of Moulin, which was a dependency of the square tower of Gentilly. It was a mill on a hill near the chateau of Winchester. There was a miller's wife there who was nursing a fine child. It was not far from the university, and Claude carried the little Jihan to her in his own arms. From that moment forth, feeling that he had a burden to bear, he took life very seriously. The thought of his little brother became not only his recreation, but the object of his studies. He resolved to consecrate himself entirely to a future for which he was responsible in the sight of God, and never to have any other wife, any other child, than the happiness and fortune of his brother. Therefore, he attached himself more closely than ever to the clerical profession. His merits, his learning, his quality of immediate vassal of the Bishop of Paris threw the doors of the church wide open to him. At the age of 20, by special dispensation of the Holy See, he was a priest, and served as the youngest of the chaplains of Notre-Dame, the altar which is called, because of the late mass which is said there, Alter Pigrorum. There, plunged more deeply than ever in his dear books, which he quitted only to run for an hour to the fief of Moulin, this mixture of learning and austerity, so rare at his age, had promptly acquired for him the respect and admiration of the monastery. From the cloister, his reputation as a learned man had passed to the people, among whom it had changed a little. A frequent concurrence at that time into reputation as a sorcerer. It was at the moment when he was returning, on Quasimodo Day, from saying his mass at the altar of the Lazy, which was by the side of the door leading to the nave on the right, near the image of the Virgin, that his attention had been attracted by the group of the old women chattering around the bed for fondlings. Then it was that he approached the unhappy little creature, which was so hated and so menaced. That distress, that deformity, that abandonment, the thought of his young brother, the idea which suddenly occurred to him that if he were to die, His dear little Jihan might also be flung miserably on the plank for foundlings. All this had gone to his heart simultaneously. A great pity had moved in him, and he carried off the child. When he removed the child from the sack, he found it greatly deformed and very sooth. The poor little wretch had a wart on his left eye, his head placed directly on his shoulder, his spinal column was crooked, his breastbone prominent, and his legs bowed, but he appeared to be lively, and although it was impossible to say in what language he lisped, his cry indicated considerable force and health. Claude's compassion increased at the sight of his ugliness, and he made a vow in his heart to rear the child for the love for his brother, in order that, whatever might be the future faults of the little Jihan, he should have beside him that charity done for his sake. It was a sort of investment of good works which he was effecting in the name of his young brother. It was a stock of good works which he wished to amass in advance for him, in case the little rogue should some day find himself short of that coin, the only sort which is received at the toll bar of paradise. He baptized his adopted child, and gave him the name of Quasimodo, either because he desired thereby to mark the day when he had found him, or because he wished to designate by that name to what a degree that poor little creature was incomplete, had hardly sketched out. In fact, Quasimodo, blind, hunchbacked, knock-kneed, was only an almost. End of the chapter. All right, so we get an introduction into our Claude Frollo, which from this chapter, you're like, oh, maybe he's not such a bad guy. All these women think that this baby is too ugly and, should be, killed and done away with. But not Claude. No, no, no. Out of the love for his brother and compassion for life, he's taking him in. Let's not forget that he is a learned man. He knows all the sciences. He knows everything there is to know about any sort of science. But what really saved him was the fact that his parents died and he had to go and get his little brother. But his little brother was still too small, so he gave the little brother to a nurse, and then on that day he returned on Quasimodo Day, and that is where this foundation is founded. Just like that, it's time. It is time, my friends. It seems today went by so quickly. That's what happens when when one of the chapters is over an hour long. So we will pick up right where we left off next week. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure, as always. Whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you, and I 1000% appreciate your support. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Goodbye.